Let me start with a provocative claim. If the United States and China ever fought a war over Taiwan, the most dangerous battlefield would not be the skies above the island or the waters of the Taiwan Strait. It would be something far less dramatic but far more decisive: logistics. But here's the question almost nobody asks. How do you supply a war that happens 7,000 miles away from your homeland? Most people assume American military superiority automatically guarantees victory: bigger navy, better technology, more alliances. But here's what mainstream analysis gets wrong. Wars are not won by platforms. They are won by supply chains. And if you want to understand why a Taiwan conflict becomes a logistics nightmare for Washington, you have to understand three powerful systems shaping the battlefield. System number one, geography and distance. System number two, industrial mobilization and missile saturation. And system number three, the supply chain paradox that almost nobody in the public debate talks about. Stay with me, because what comes next changes everything. Let's start with geography, because geography is the silent force behind every war ever fought. The distance between Los Angeles and Taiwan is roughly 6,078 miles. That's not a statistic most people think about, but in military planning, it changes everything. Here's what nobody tells you. Every aircraft, every missile, every gallon of fuel, and every spare part has to travel across the largest ocean on Earth. Meanwhile, China is operating practically next door. The Chinese mainland sits roughly 100 miles from Taiwan, not 1,000, not 500, 100. Let me show you what this actually means. If a U.S. aircraft carrier launches fighter jets, those jets must travel long distances, refuel repeatedly, and operate inside one of the most heavily defended missile environments on the planet. China doesn't have that problem. Chinese aircraft can launch from mainland air bases, strike, and return within minutes. Missiles can be fired from trucks, tunnels, ships, and coastal batteries. And here's the part that should surprise you. According to U.S. defense assessments, China now possesses more than 2,200 conventionally armed ballistic and cruise missiles capable of targeting bases across the Western Pacific. 2,200. This is the missile saturation problem, and it directly connects to logistics, because every base the United States relies on in the region becomes a target. Okinawa, Guam, airfields across Japan. Even massive facilities like Andersen Air Force Base sit within range of modern Chinese missiles. I remember speaking with a defense logistics analyst who spent years studying Pacific war games. Off the record, he told me something striking. In the first 72 hours, the real battle isn't ships or aircraft, he said. It's whether the U.S. can keep runways open and fuel flowing. Think about that for a moment. The world's most powerful military could find itself fighting not just an enemy, but distance, infrastructure, and time. This is the geography trap. Most people think military power is about how many ships you have. But here's what really matters: how quickly you can repair a runway, reload a missile, or refuel a fighter jet. And this connects to something even bigger, because geography alone doesn't decide wars. Industrial capacity does. The second system shaping this conflict is something far less visible but far more powerful: the production engines behind modern warfare. And once you see how missile manufacturing, shipbuilding, and industrial scale interact, the entire Taiwan war debate starts to look very different. Because the side that replaces weapons fastest usually wins long wars. And China has been quietly building something that most Western audiences still underestimate: shipyards, missile factories, industrial mobilization networks. So the real question becomes this: if a Taiwan conflict turns into a prolonged war of production, who actually has the advantage? Because the numbers behind that answer are far more shocking than most headlines suggest. And once we examine those numbers, you'll start to see why the logistics nightmare might only be the beginning of a much bigger strategic problem. So let's dig into the second system, because this is where the story gets even more uncomfortable for Washington. But before we go there, you need to understand one So here's the second force at work, and this one operates very differently from geography. Geography limits movement. Industrial power determines endurance. And if you want to understand why the Taiwan debate inside the Pentagon has become so tense in recent years, you have to look at the production numbers behind modern warfare. Because here's the uncomfortable reality most people never hear about. Wars today burn through weapons at staggering speeds. Missiles, drones, precision-guided munitions, aircraft parts, they're consumed faster than factories can replace them. So let me ask you something. What happens if the most advanced military in the world runs out of weapons faster than it can produce them? Let me show you the numbers that matter. During the first year of the Ukraine war, the United States produced roughly 14,155 mm artillery shells per month. That sounds like a lot, but Ukrainian forces were firing as many as 7,000 shells per day during intense fighting. 7,000. In other words, an entire month of American production could be consumed in just a few days of large-scale combat. Now think about what a Taiwan war would look like. Missiles would be launched by the thousands, anti-ship weapons, long-range strike missiles, air defense interceptors. These are incredibly complex systems, and they cannot be replaced overnight. Here's what nobody tells you about modern missile manufacturing. Many precision weapons require hundreds of specialized components, advanced semiconductors, rocket motors, guidance systems, rare materials. If even one part of that chain slows down, production stops. And that leads directly to the China industrial paradox. Most people think China's military power comes mainly from its growing navy. But here's what's really happening behind the scenes. China is building the industrial base for sustained warfare. If you want to understand this, just look at shipbuilding. According to U.S. naval intelligence estimates, Chinese shipyards have more than 230 times the shipbuilding capacity of the United States. 230 times. Let that number sink in for a moment. Here's what matters. Capacity doesn't just build ships, it builds resilience. When I spoke with a maritime economist who tracks global shipyards, he told me something fascinating. China didn't build shipyards for war, he said. They built them for commerce. But the same infrastructure can pivot to military production very quickly. This is the part that should surprise you. Many of China's largest shipyards produce both commercial cargo ships and naval vessels, the same cranes, the same dry docks, the same workforce. So if a long conflict ever happened in the Pacific, China could expand naval production far faster than most Western planners would like. Now combine that with missile production. China has spent the last 2 decades building massive missile inventories, especially anti-ship systems designed specifically to target aircraft carriers and logistics hubs. This strategy even has a name inside military circles: anti-access, area denial, A2AD. The idea is simple. Instead of matching the United States ship for ship, you build enough long-range weapons to make the region extremely dangerous for American forces. And here's the paradox. The more advanced American platforms become, aircraft carriers, stealth bombers, destroyers, the more expensive they are to replace. Meanwhile, the missiles designed to threaten them can be produced in far larger numbers. The weapon that was supposed to create strength becomes the vulnerability. This is the industrial pressure point. But stay with me, because this connects to something even bigger. Because logistics is not just about distance, and it's not just about factories. There's a third system shaping the Taiwan equation that almost nobody in mainstream discussions talks about. And once you see it, the entire strategic balance looks different. I heard a senior economist in Singapore describe it in one sentence that stuck with me. A Taiwan war would not just be a military conflict, he said. It would be the largest supply chain shock in human history. And that leads us directly into the third system, the global supply chain paradox. Because if this conflict ever happened, The country trying to defend Taiwan might also be deeply dependent on the same economic networks tied to China, which raises a question that very few policymakers publicly confront. What happens when the world's most powerful military depends on the world's largest manufacturing economy? That's where the real strategic puzzle begins. And once we break that down, you'll understand why some analysts quietly believe the logistics nightmare is only the surface of the problem. The deeper challenge lies in the global economic system itself. So let's examine that final system, because this is where the Taiwan question stops being a regional dispute and starts becoming a global crisis. So let's talk about the third system shaping the Taiwan war debate, because this is where the entire discussion becomes uncomfortable. Not militarily uncomfortable, economically uncomfortable. Here's the question almost nobody asks out loud. What happens when the country trying to contain China is deeply dependent on China's industrial ecosystem? Think about that for a moment. How do you sustain a long war against the world's largest manufacturing hub while your own economy relies on its supply chains? This is the global supply chain paradox. And here's what mainstream commentary usually misses. China doesn't just manufacture consumer goods. It dominates entire categories of strategic industrial production. Let me show you the numbers that matter. China produces roughly 30% of global manufacturing output. Not 20%, not 25%, 30%. That is larger than the manufacturing output of the United States, Japan, Germany, and South Korea combined. Now pause and ask yourself something. If a war over Taiwan triggered massive economic decoupling, what happens to the industries that depend on Chinese inputs, electronics, rare earth processing, pharmaceutical ingredients, machine tooling, solar components? This is the part that should terrify policymakers. China processes about 90% of the world's rare earth minerals, materials essential for missiles, fighter jets, radar systems, and advanced electronics. So here's the uncomfortable truth. The same materials required to build advanced weapon systems often pass through supply chains connected to China. That's not speculation. It's the current structure of the global economy. A senior defense economist once explained it to me this way. During the Cold War, the US and Soviet Union were economically separate systems, he said. But today, the two largest powers are economically intertwined. And that changes the strategic equation. Because modern war isn't just about ships and missiles. It's about supply chains, factories, energy flows, and industrial ecosystems. If those systems fracture overnight, the consequences ripple everywhere. Now let's bring Taiwan into this picture, because Taiwan itself sits at the center of one of the most important supply chains on Earth, semiconductors. If you want to understand the global stakes of a Taiwan conflict, just look at the chip industry. One company alone, Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company, produces more than 90% of the world's most advanced chips. These chips power smartphones, artificial intelligence systems, fighter jets, data centers, and satellites. So imagine a scenario where that production suddenly stops. Global electronics manufacturing would collapse within months. Automobile production lines would shut down. Defense systems would face critical component shortages. This is why economists call Taiwan the most dangerous economic flashpoint in the world. Because a conflict there wouldn't just disrupt trade, it would shock the technological foundation of the modern economy. And here's the paradox. The United States relies heavily on Taiwanese semiconductor manufacturing. China also relies heavily on it, which means both sides would face catastrophic economic consequences in a war. This is what strategists call mutual vulnerability. But here's what makes people uncomfortable. Mutual vulnerability does not always prevent conflict. Sometimes it simply makes the consequences consequences harder to imagine. If you're finding this valuable, hit that like button because what comes next connects all three systems we've been discussing: geography, industrial production, global supply chains. Individually, each one shapes the Taiwan debate. But when they interact, they create a strategic puzzle that military planners have struggled with for years. Distance stretches American logistics. Industrial scale favors rapid production on China's side. And the global economy ties both systems together in ways that make prolonged conflict incredibly destabilizing. So, the real question isn't simply who wins a Taiwan war. The real question is whether such a war could even be contained. Because once these systems start interacting, the effects would extend far beyond the Taiwan Strait. Energy markets, technology supply chains, global finance, all of them would feel the shockwaves. And that brings us to the final part of this discussion. Because when you step back and look at all three forces together, a new framework emerges. One that explains why the Taiwan issue has become the most dangerous strategic flashpoint of the 21st century. Let me pull everything together and show you what the next decade might actually look like. So let me pull all of this together because once you connect the three systems we've discussed, the Taiwan question starts to look very different from the way it's usually presented. Most public discussions focus on ships, aircraft carriers, or fighter jets, but those are only the visible layer of power. Underneath that layer are three deeper forces shaping the outcome of any potential conflict: geography, industrial production, and global supply chains. I call this the logistics triangle of power. If you want to understand why the Taiwan issue has become the most dangerous geopolitical flashpoint of the 21st century, just look at how these three forces interact. First, geography creates the battlefield imbalance. Taiwan sits roughly 100 miles from mainland China, but nearly 7,000 miles from the continental United States. That difference changes everything about how a war would be supplied and sustained. Here's what matters. Every aircraft sortie, every naval deployment, every missile reload requires logistics, fuel, maintenance, transport, infrastructure, and distance multiplies every one of those challenges. Meanwhile, China operates inside its own neighborhood. This is the geography paradox. The stronger global power has to fight across the planet. The regional power fights from home. Now layer the second force on top of that, industrial capacity. Because wars are rarely decided in the opening weeks. They are decided by who can keep producing weapons once the initial stockpiles run out. Let me show you something fascinating. During World War II, the United States produced nearly 300,000 aircraft between 1940 and 1945. That industrial surge ultimately overwhelmed Axis production. But here's what makes modern geopolitics different. Today, China possesses the world's largest manufacturing base. According to global manufacturing data, China accounts for about 30% of total industrial output. The United States sits closer to 16%. This is not a small difference, it's a structural one. And that leads to the third force, supply chain interdependence, because the global economy has created something history has never seen before. Two rival superpowers deeply embedded in the same economic ecosystem: rare earth minerals, electronics manufacturing, machine tools, shipping infrastructure. All of these networks cross national boundaries. So, a Taiwan conflict wouldn't just be a regional war, it would be a shock to the global industrial system. Here's the uncomfortable truth. The world economy is not built to survive that kind of disruption easily. When I spoke with a trade strategist in Singapore, he described Taiwan as the hinge point of the modern technological world. That phrase stuck with me. Because if that hinge breaks, the consequences cascade everywhere. Semiconductor shortages, financial market panic, global trade disruptions, energy price spikes. And this is why the Taiwan issue is so strategically dangerous. Not because war is inevitable, but because the systems surrounding the conflict are so tightly interconnected. Now here's the big question. What happens over the next decade? There are three realistic scenarios analysts discuss behind closed doors. Scenario 1, deterrence holds. The cost of conflict remains so high that neither side risks direct war. Military competition continues, but actual fighting never happens. Scenario 2, a prolonged standoff. Taiwan becomes the center of an extended geopolitical Cold War in Asia. Economic decoupling accelerates. Supply chains shift slowly away from China, but tensions remain permanently high. Scenario 3, a crisis spirals out of control, an accident at sea, a blockade, a miscalculation during a military exercise, and suddenly the world is facing the largest geopolitical shock since World War II. Which of those futures is most likely? Here's what nobody can say with certainty, because the outcome depends on decisions made by leaders, militaries, and economies interacting in real time. But one thing is clear. If you want to understand the Taiwan question, you cannot just count ships or missiles. You have to look at the deeper systems, the logistics triangle of power, geography, industry, supply chains. Those three forces will shape the balance of power in the Pacific for decades to come. Now I want to hear your perspective. Do you think geography alone makes a Taiwan conflict unwinnable for the United States? Or do alliances and technology change the equation? Let me know in the comments. And if you want more deep geopolitical breakdowns like this, the kind that go beyond headlines and into the real strategic dynamics, make sure you subscribe, because the next decade of global politics is going to be shaped by forces most people still don't see.